Um,
Sure.
Hello, I'm Martin. Sitting beside me is Gretchen, who I'll pass the talk off to shortly. Thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you to all the people who have remained to the very end of the conference. Our topic today is, as the title says here, matrilateral bias in childcare and an investment by grandparents. And if some of that is a little hard to understand, I hope it will soon be clear. We begin with the concept of parenting. Why does parental care exist in many animal species? I hope it's obvious that the reason why parental care has evolved repeatedly is because one's offspring are the vehicles of one's genetic fitness. Investing in their well being, helping them become reproductive adults in their turn, is how you achieve genetic posterity. Alloparents are persons other than parents who behave in an analogous way in investing in children. And other relatives of a child, such as grandparents, siblings, aunts, and uncles, can also gain fitness by investing in the child because they're genetic relatives and the child's eventual reproduction will contribute to the reproduction of their genes. And for that reason, they have evolved to provide alloparental care and investment, parent-like care, in many species, and most notably in the human animal. In the human animal, Homo sapiens, contributions by alloparents, and especially by grandmothers, are sometimes crucial to the well-being and development of children. This is an exemplary picture of a Hadza grandmother with her grandchild, a Hadza hunter-gatherer in Tanzania. Now, the phrase the matrilateral investment bias in our title referred to the fact that on average, maternal relatives, and here, for example, we say maternal grandmothers, who will abbreviate in this way MGMs repeatedly, invest more in their grandchildren than do paternal grandmothers, the mother of the father of the children. And other maternal kin, grandfathers, aunts, and uncles, also invest more than their paternal counterparts. And there's a very nice example of that in a very recent paper by Alireza Nikaktar, who spoke earlier today, and who we believe is in the audience, illustrating this with respect to Iranian aunts and uncles. I'm going to illustrate it with respect to European grandmothers. And the data that you see here, sorry if this slide is a bit overwhelming, come from the so-called SHARE study. SHARE is an acronym for the Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe, which is a massive interview undertaking with tens of thousands of persons over the age of 50, having been interviewed about many aspects of their lives, including if they have children, where those children now reside, how far away from themselves, whether those children have children of their own, and whether you care for them, also people's health, financial circumstances, and so on. And this is the output of an analysis which controls for things like health and the grandmother's age and the proximity to the child, and analyzes grandmothers' self-reported probabilities of having provided frequent child care, by which I mean almost weekly or more, in the absence of the parents. So this is more than merely being there when the children are there, but it's also being there when the children are there and the parents are not, and how often they've done this for their daughters or their sons. If you're not familiar with odds ratios, all you need to know is that an odds ratio of 1 would indicate that you're equally likely to invest in your daughter's child and your son's child. An odds ratio greater than 1 means you're more likely to invest in your daughter's child. And of course, caring for your daughter's child is the same thing as a matrilateral bias. We say matrilateral from the perspective of the child. It's getting the investment from the maternal side. From the perspective of the grandmother, it's investing in her daughter's child. And what you see here is that in every one of these 20 European countries, care is biased towards investing preferentially in your daughter's children as opposed to your son's children, and usually significantly so. Why does such an investment bias even exist? Evolutionists have been interested in it for a long time, and they've attributed it to uncertain paternity. The idea is that your son's child might not be his, whereas your daughter's certainly is. And there's a joking expression in English that says, Mama's baby, Papa's maybe. That is to say, you can be sure, the mother can be sure it's her kid, the father cannot. And Martin Smith, a Canadian psychologist, was, to the best of our knowledge, the first person to propose and test the following hypothesis. He thought that grandparents would invest differentially in grandchildren, with maternal grandmothers investing the most, paternal grandmothers and maternal grandfathers less, and paternal grandfathers investing the least because they have 0, 1, and 2 uncertain links. And he did a questionnaire study that supported this hypothesis. A great deal of subsequent research has also supported it. But there's a further reason why natural selection should favor this bias, which I will try to explain briefly. What the uncertain paternity hypothesis implicitly assumes is that the eventual fitness payback to this alloparental investor, a grandparent or whoever, is delivered by the product of the child's gain in fitness. You invested in the child and you improved its fitness, and the child's relatedness to you, the investing allo parent. And the reason why there's a matrilateral bias is because that latter value, the child's relatedness to the allo parent, has to be discounted by the degree of paternity error. But alloparental investment is not an investment only in the child and only in improving the child's fitness. Alloparental investment raises the mother's fitness often as well. And that's because it lowers demands on the mother and leaves her with more resources, perhaps in better condition and so on, and increases her own potential to promote her inclusive fitness in various ways, what we call her nepotistic value by extension of Fisher's concept of reproductive value, if you're familiar with that. So think about what a woman who, by virtue of having had help from her mother, say, how she might invest the gains in her nepotistic value from that help. She might invest them in the same child, the child sired by a current partner. She might invest them in children, invest it in children that she brought to the present union from a former union. She might invest in children who are sired by a future partner after the present relationship ends through death or divorce, for example. And she might invest in children who were sired by an extra pair partner, but she can invest in her own siblings, in her nieces and nephews, in her cousins and distant kin. And notice that almost all of these, with the exception of the last one where she invests in paternal relatives, entail some sort of inclusive fitness payback for the mother who helped increase her nepotistic value. If her mother-in-law helps increase her nepotistic value, she gets payback only through the first of these items. And arguably, this is a reason why we would expect to see a matrilateral bias in investment, even if paternity were perfectly certain, even if there were no such thing as paternity uncertainty, it would still pay you to invest more in your daughter's child than in your son's child, your daughter-in-law's child. And now I will turn it over to Gretchen.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to take over here and talk about some specific research that I and Martin have done related to this. And I'm going to start with a project that I did in an agency that I actually worked with a number of years ago. And it was a child protection agency, and we were focused on looking at children who were removed from their parents' care due to neglect or abuse, and who had been placed in the extended family um, under foster care arrangements. So these were temporary changes of primary caregiver to extended family under the eye of Child Protection Services. And we wanted to get a sense of who was providing that care and the benefit of that care. Here is a slide showing the length of placement under two conditions, either the maternal family providing that care or the paternal family over time. And what you can see is that maternal placements are more stable or last longer than placements with father's family. The reason why this was an important outcome measure for us is because placement stability is very strongly associated with better outcomes for children in terms of physical and mental health, educational attainment, employment as an adult, involvement in crime. All of those outcomes are better if placements are more stable. And what we find is placements are more stable with mother's kin. And when we looked at the data, we looked at who was providing that care within those categories of maternal or paternal caregiver. So, who takes them in? Well, the number one relative was grandparents, above and beyond any other relative. And so we dove a little deeper into that category of grandparent, considering relationship status as well as maternal paternal caregiver. What you'll see here is when grandparents were in their original couple, we have somewhat more maternal grandparents providing care than paternal, but it's quite similar. When we get to the circumstances of grandparent with a new partner, where it's a step grandparent that's not related to the focal child, we see that the proportion of maternal relatives are greater. We see a greater maternal bias in providing that care. This is greatest when we have single grandparents providing care, and this is predominantly single maternal grandmothers, as the person who provides more care than any other category of caregiver in these foster arrangements. And really, the summary of this story is that as the circumstance becomes more difficult, where people are living on their own or living with a partner who isn't related to the child, where they're needing to provide that support with less and less assistance, we have paternal family dropping away and maternal family being much more resilient. Is this true just in this unusual circumstance of child protection? Well, we went back to the shared data and explored this question. And Martin has described the data set already. And this is data that I'm going to show you of circumstances where we looked at data of who was providing care under what circumstances, looking purely at grandmothers who were not residing with either of their own children. So, and we're again providing care when the parents weren't around. And what you can see as circumstances become more difficult in these various domains, we get an increase in that matrilateral bias. So, again, we're looking at odds ratios. Anything above one is a matrilateral bias. A bigger number above one is a more extreme matrilateral bias. And what you see is if the grandmother is single, the matrilateral bias is more extreme. If her financial situation is more difficult, there's a greater matrilateral bias. If her health is worse, we have again a greater matrilateral bias. So, in all of these circumstances, as the situation becomes more difficult, the matrilateral bias is increasing. But does this actually have a benefit to the children? In studies of small scale societies and historical societies that we read about, maternal grandmothers often had a positive effect on child survival. So there was an association between maternal grandmothers being alive or being involved where children's mortality was actually improved. Whereas with paternal grandmothers who were alive or involved, there were circumstances where actually mortality got worse for grandchildren. And this is apparently true even in predominantly patrilocal societies. Patrilocal societies are ones where the woman moves to the husband's family after marriage. And this is an important distinction because most of the world's population lives in cultures that have a history of patrilineal and patrilocal societies. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about next, focusing particularly on these patrilineal and patrilocal societies. Patrilineal just means that um, when inheritance goes down the father's line. So the research that I did in rural Bangladesh, which is both patrilineal and patrilocal, really highlights key elements of what we're talking about. I interviewed children's primary caregivers in 5 different family types. These family types involved where the two parents were residing together, where the father was away for migrant labor. These two categories of family were highly preferential family types. I also investigated and interviewed families where either mother or father were deceased or the parents were divorced. These latter family types were highly stigmatized and definitely not preferred family types. This provided a window into variable difficulty of raising children. It identified who alloparental investors were and helped us understand predicting child outcomes based on alloparental investment. And to give you a little information about Bangladesh, we were focused on Matlab, Bangladesh, where parents live in family compounds or baris. So here you can see that they're highly isolated, raised family compounds where there's multiple households within a bari, where all the women are working on the domestic demands, looking after the children, processing rice, doing all the cooking and cleaning. The husbands and men in the family are out working in growing rice and harvesting it. Women engage in purdah, so they don't leave the bari unless they're supervised or chaperoned by males in the family. And when women are in the domestic sphere, their mother in law is in charge of what happens. Not surprisingly, children live closer to the paternal grandmother than the maternal grandmother, and paternal grandmothers provide more intermittent or supplementary childcare. No surprise. However, there's some important caveats here or distinctions to be made. In these circumstances, maternal grandmothers provided more care than paternal grandmothers when proximity was controlled. Women preferred to go home to their mothers to give birth, and many do. In fact, many women left prior to giving birth and stayed many months, almost until the children were weaned. And they felt that they got more supportive, nurturing care there. And couples with children usually moved to their own homes, often neo-locally, if they had the financial means to do so. There was a preference not to be in the patrilocal bari if they could. And divorced women and her children usually returned to her family of origin or the matrilateral bari, if at all possible, because again, they had better support there. So maintaining contact with maternal family was not always easy. Maintaining those contacts was essential for maintaining these supports, but it was difficult. Women didn't have phones. They were engaging in purdah, so needed permission from their mother-in-law to do this. And when we analyzed the data, we considered family circumstances where women did not reside with the grandmother, but consistently women visited their own mother far more frequently than their mother-in-law. And much more commonly, it was the case that women never visited their mother-in-law compared to circumstances where they never visited their own mother. So women were making considerable effort to maintain this special relationship. But we can also consider not just relationship or investment in children through childcare. Providing material resources was an important element and didn't require proximity. And so here's a slide showing the different family types and who was the primary or greatest material investor. This included things like food, clothing, health care, education, clearly important things to children's well-being. And the number one person to provide care was maternal family more generally, certainly much more than paternal family. But the number one caregiver was, in fact, mother's brother providing that care. So it wasn't just maternal grandmothers, it was broader family caregiving, despite the fact that there was the cultural stereotype that father's family was supposed to provide for a child if the father could not provide himself. But is this care more beneficial to the child? So maternal family are doing more of it, but does it help the child? While children whose parents were in intact marriages were significantly better educated if they lived with a maternal grandmother rather than paternal, and if their primary alloparental caregiver was the maternal grandmother or another matrilateral relative. And in general, children raised elsewhere than the paternal bari and with more maternal kin contact did best. And this was controlling for income. And when I say they did best, this is based on the children being taller, being heavier, being having greater weight, and having better education on average. So my research found that there was a clear matrilateral bias, even when contrary to cultural stereotypes, that children did better with maternal grandmother involvement, and maternal grandmothers were more involved than proximity would predict, and that mothers worked hard to maintain contact with maternal grandmother. That when the situation was more challenging, maternal grandmother involvement was important and increased, and that matrilateral bias extends to other relatives, especially maternal uncles. But is this true of other patrilineal and patrilocal societies? And what we found in a review of the literature is that in these societies, new mothers are noted to have a very special relationship with their own mothers that's particularly important at that high risk time in her early reproductive career and prior to weaning. And so these are just a few minor examples. The Himba of Namibia, when they were interviewing women with young children, they're supposed to be living patrilocally, but in fact, more than 60% of the time, women were interviewed in their own mother's residence because that's where women were spending their time when they had young children. In Aboriginal groups in Australia, it was found there's many instances of women talking about this strong, special relationship with their own mother. And in unpublished data of the Denham data set of the Aluwara, what I found is that with these nomadic groups of the Aluwara, when women are about to give birth or have recently give birth, they're co-residing with their own mother or sister, um, which is something that they don't do when they don't have young children or newborns. In rural villages in Shandong, China, women have the cultural stereotype of the paternal grandmother living with the family and supporting to raise the children. But in fact, this only occurs after the children have been weaned when women are going back to work. And in fact, prior to that, women have a strong relationship and often reside with their own mother prior to weaning of the young children. With the Oromo of southern Ethiopia, women are visited by their own mother and their mother-in-laws. But when those visits occur, their own mother provides heavy labor in their gardens, whereas the mother-in-law is known to just doing light housework. So clearly there's special and distinctively different things happening between mothers and mother-in-laws in terms of their investment and the importance of those relationships. So what I found was that there was a matrilateral bias being widespread culturally, and the more difficult the circumstances, the greater that bias becomes. Support in more difficult circumstances comes not only from the maternal grandmother, but from other maternal family members too, that the matrilateral bias and support can be detected even where patrilineal ideologies prevail. And in diverse societies, having access to maternal grandmothers and other maternal relatives is apparently more beneficial than access to paternal kin. And for final notes, I'm going to pass it over to Martin.
Thank you, Gretchen. Um, I have one question I'd like to leave you with, and that has to do with cousin marriage. Charles Darwin married his cousin Emma Wedgwood, and for Emma, her mother-in-law was her father's sister, so was also her aunt. Darwin's mother had been in exactly the same boat. Her mother-in-law also was her father's sister and hence her aunt. So in societies where cousin marriage is common, it often repeats in multiple generations and complicates the story greatly. We've been talking about mother-in-law as if she's a non-relative, but what if she also happens to be your aunt, and so forth? Cousin marriage concentrates relatedness, if you like, both matrilineally and patrilineal in interesting ways. It's our understanding that cousin marriage has, at least in the past, and perhaps still is, fairly common in Iran. And not only cousin marriage, but cousin marriage of all types, cross and parallel cousins, and patrilateral and matrilateral cousins. And if this be so, then there's a lot of opportunity, perhaps for people in the audience, to make a really interesting original contribution by investigating whether the kind of phenomena we've been talking about and calling a matrilateral bias in investment are somehow changed or compromised in conditions of cousin marriage. And indeed, there's room for some theoretical development on that topic as well, which would be much appreciated by people interested in this topic. And with that, we'd like to thank you for your time and attention and turn it back to Reza. Thank you for staying.